So today we will be talking about the Guanche indigenous Amazigh culture of the Canary Islands with my guest, Jose Farrujia de la Rosa, who is an archaeologist. This is meant to be just a quick background before I show you the interview. Now, the Canary Islands and their original inhabitants have been the subject of much speculation and many legends. Now, we know today, based on DNA and archaeological evidence, that they are related to the Berber people of, or Amazighh as they prefer to be called, people of North Africa. Wherever you are watching this video from, the theme is really how little we know about our past and our identities, and as opposed to what sometimes the school textbooks say. In other words, a lot of our past histories and identities are sometimes marginalized or even erased because they do not serve political objectives in the present. Now, going back to the Canary Islands, now, during the Spanish conquest of the Canaries in the 1400s, many of the original inhabitants mounted a fierce resistance and were either massacred, sold into slavery, or died of disease. Some did survive, but the language is long lost, and what was left from the culture was assimilated. The people like my guest are challenging these discourses and giving this extinct culture a voice.
Hello everybody, it's a pleasure also for me to be here speaking about the Canary Islands. I became interested in the archaeology really a long time ago. At the beginnings, as every archaeologist, I was really interested in Egypt, but as I started to study my own land, the land of the so-called Guanches, the Canary indigenous people, I decided that I didn't want to study Egypt, but the Canary indigenous populations. And that was more than 20 years ago. That was the reason why I became interested in archaeology. Also, because these indigenous people, they suffered a really violent war against the people from the Spanish mainland, the Castilian and the people from Aragon as well, in the 15th century, the conquest of the Canary Islands. And since then, the Canarian indigenous culture was undervalued. So one of my tasks was to give voice to this culture and to tell people how did they live, how did they develop their culture on the islands, and how they were alike.
I read your article. I mean, you have made a few publications. The one that I read and that introduced me to your work is this article here. If you can see it, if you have time, you can read it. I think the main thesis, from what I understood, is that you studied rock art and inscriptions, alphabets and symbols in the Canary Islands, and you tried to link them to alphabets and symbols and rock art in North Africa.
The early human colonization of the Canary Islands came from the north of Africa. Nowadays, we have very few radiocarbonic dates, but we already know that the first human colonization took place on the first millennium before Christ, at the beginnings of the first millennium before Christ. One of the islands, called Lanzarote, received by those dates the first human inhabitants. And after Lanzarote, the other islands of the archipelago started to be colonized as well. So what we did in the paper you were talking about before was to research the inscriptions that these populations brought into the Canary Islands. in order to establish comparisons with the ones we have in the Canary Islands and the ones we found in the north part of Africa. For example, in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and also the Sahara. So we found that the first human wave of colonization that arrived to the Canary Islands, they brought with them the so-called libyco-berber inscriptions, or the libyco-berber alphabet, which is present in the whole archipelago. The Canary Islands are formed by 7 islands, and all of them contain this inscription. And later in time, coinciding with the presence of the Roman Empire in the north of Africa, and this was about the 1st century before Christ and the 1st century after Christ, by those dates, a second wave of population came to the Canary Islands. And as a consequence of their contact with the Romans in the north of Africa, their alphabet began to experiment a couple of changes. In this sense, they developed a different alphabet, which we call Latin Canarian alphabet. And this alphabet is only present in 2 of the islands, Lanzarote and Fuerteventura. And today we know that this alphabet is very, very particular in time, in the sense that we can only speak about this alphabet if we relate it to the Roman presence in the north of Africa. In Lanzarote and Fuerteventura, in the same panels, we have libyco-berber and Latin Canarian inscriptions. And as far as we know, they are not long texts, but just names, personal names, names of gods, and sometimes names of natural places of the islands. For example, names like Aníbal or Ausubel have been written in Latino Canarian. And in the case of the libyco-berber inscriptions, we have the same problem. They are now currently being studied, and as far as we know, we just know that there are a few sentences with names and names of gods as well, but as I say, they are now being studied, so we don't know really very much about the meanings.
They have this famous stone, the Zenata stone, and I don't think I'm not sure you talked about it in your work that I saw. So what is the connection with that stone, which is found in Tenerife, which I don't think fits into these 2 systems of alphabets that you're describing?
Yeah, the thing is that this stone has not been accepted by the whole community of the archaeologists in the Canary Islands, in the sense that the stone didn't appear in an archaeological digging, but it was given to the museum by a personal person. I mean, it appeared certainly. So we have quite a lot of doubts about the authenticity of the stone itself. So this is one of the reasons why quite a lot of the archaeologists in the Canary Islands do not use this stone as an argument to explain the early human colonization of the Canary Islands.
Okay, unless maybe other stones are found in an archaeological dig that are similar, right?
Not yet.
Not yet, unless, yes. And we can talk about alphabetical things forever, but popular science articles, for example, when they talk about the Canary Islands, they refer to cro-magnon or cro-magnon, which is a bit confusing to me, because when you say cro-magnon, you associate it with Europe, but as far as we know, the indigenous Canarians, based on the DNA studies, have very close links with the North African Berber Amazighity people. So can you make sense out of that? Or
yeah, at the end of the 19th century, there was an important presence in the Canary Islands of French researchers, mainly anthropologists. When they found in the caves of the island the schools, they sent them to Paris, to Quatrefages and Hamy, two of the main anthropologists of that time in France, and they studied the schools. And they found that there were quite a lot of similarities between the Canarian schools and those that belonged to the ancient Celts, to the Cro-Magnon race. So since then, even the Spanish and the French anthropologists and archaeologists started to establish a comparison, a relation between the early human population of France and the early human population of the Canary Islands. According to the theories that were developed by those days in the 19th century, the Celts would have come to the north of Africa, and from there they would have arrived to the Canary Islands. So this could explain the presence of the Cro-Magnon race in the Canary Islands. But nowadays we know that at the end of the 19th century, it took place the conquest of Africa by the French and German empires. And the Canary Islands was a very important place, as it has a really, really strategical location in the Atlantic. And the French and German Empire wanted to colonize, to conquer the Canary Islands in the 19th century. So science was an argument used by that time in order to establish links between French people and Canarian people. So for the French anthropologists, the relationships between the Cro-Magnon race and the Canarian indigenous people was an argument to conquer the Canary Islands at the end of the 19th century, because the ancient Celts were the early human colonizers of the Canary Islands. Of course, this was not a scientific speech, but a political speech with very clear imperialist implications. So later in time, during the dictatorship in Spain under Franco, they also considered that the Cro-Magnon race was present in the Canary Islands. In fact, we know that the Cro-Magnon race was present in the Canary Islands, but they didn't come from France. They came from the north of Africa. And as you said before, the DNA research has confirmed that a 55% of the human population of the Canary Islands has its closest links in the Maghreb, in the northern part of Africa. Yeah. So from the DNA point of view, we have finally found an answer. So nowadays we know that our ancestors, the early indigenous people, came from the north of Africa, and they didn't come from France.
I was just struck by many place names that you could find in places similar to names you find in North Africa. And yeah, so place names that start with ta or t or a. A is the masculine form according to my understanding. So my question for you is, do you know if somebody who has done an etymological study linking place names with Berber language, Amazighity language?
Yes, in fact, as a consequence of the conquest of the Canary Islands in the 15th century, the language disappeared, but we still keep the ancient names, the toponyms, for the name of the towns, of the villages. And as you said, there are quite a lot of similarities between our names and those found in the north of Africa. And there are quite a lot of books recently published which have a study from the philological point of view this relationship. And in fact, we know that quite a lot of these ancient names have their correspondences in places like the Central Sahara, northern parts of Morocco, Algeria, or Tunisia. So from the philological point of view, we also know that there is no doubt about the Amazigh root of the Canary Islands.
Some of your recent work, and I haven't read it, talks about identity. And I just want to quote you from, there is this historian, Israeli historian, his name is Shlomo Sand, and here's a quote. So he's saying, the writing of national history is not, or does not seriously mean to uncover past civilizations. Its principal aim is the construction of meta-identities and the political consolidation of the present. So this is an interesting quote. So how does this relate to your work?
Yeah,
so that
this is one of the main topics I've been researching lately. Because in the Canary Islands, as I told you before, during the 60s and the 70s, we had the Franco's dictatorship. And during Franco's dictatorship, the country was conceived as a whole country without any internal divisions from the point of view of regionalities. So according to the archaeologists that work under the dictatorship, the Canary Islands, of course, belonged to Spain, and also supposedly they had received a population from a culture called Ibero-Mauritanian and Ibero-Saharian. So according to the archaeologists of that time, there was an Iberian presence in the Canary Islands. This means that our identity was more Spanish than North African. But at the same time, this was an argument used in order to justify the military presence of Spain, not only in the north part of Africa, but also in the Canary Islands. So we belonged to Spain, as well as the Spanish colonies in the north of Africa, for example, the Spanish Sahara. So archaeology was used by the political regime in order to create identities. And the Canarian indigenous people, they were seen as Iberians, as Hispanic people, not as North Africans. So when the dictatorship ended in the late 1970s, and the new wave of archaeologists started to research, we've seen that we still have a very strong presence of that ancient speech that comes from the Franco's regime, in the sense that during the 1980s, the Canarian indigenous people were seen as North Africans, but as the local archaeologists from the Canary Islands didn't know very well the archaeology of the northern part of Africa, they described our reality taking into consideration only our archaeology and not making comparisons with the northern part of Africa. So our archaeology was more Canarian than African. And nowadays, one of the things we have noticed is that quite a lot of researchers do not use the concept Amazigh when speaking about the Canary indigenous people, because Amazigh, which means all free people, and which is the name the Berbers, the North African Berbers, call themselves Amazigh people. This concept nowadays has a very strong political meaning. For quite a lot of researchers here in the Canary Islands, it's not very, I would say, they don't want to use that concept because it has clear political implications. But some other archaeologists, I am one of them, we consider that the Amazigh culture has its origins more than 3,000 years ago, and even that concept, Amazigh, exists since the 12th century before Christ. So one thing is, okay, Amazigh has a political meaning, the concept, but the truth is that the Amazigh people existed since the 12th century before Christ. So we do want to use that concept. We want to call things by their real names. We don't have any intentions of silence the cultural reality. We want to just describe things as they are.
Tenerife was a bit, it stands out. It's huge as an island in terms of its physical size. It has the longest history of resisting the Spanish, the mummies, mummification practices. But according to your, my impression is that it has yielded the least number of inscriptions and rock art. Do you see the contradiction? Like, for example, El Hierro is very tiny, but I was surprised to see that it yielded quite a few of these rock art.
I understand what you mean. Yes. In fact, there is nowadays we don't have a clear clue to explain that, because, as you say, Tenerife has an extension of 2,000 square kilometers. And in the case of El Hierro, for example, from side to side, there are just about 42 kilometers. So why do the Canary indigenous people made more inscriptions in El Hierro than in Tenerife? We don't really know. I mean, what we know is that the people that came to the Canary Islands, they belonged to different tribes in the north of Africa, to different Amazigh tribes. And in fact, there are 7 islands and 7 different cultures. All of them, they belong to the Amazigh people, but as there was no contact between islands, nowadays we know that they didn't know how to sail in the 15th century. We don't know why did they lose the knowledge about sailing, but the fact is that in the 15th century, when the Europeans arrived to the Canary Islands, the Canary indigenous people didn't know how to sail. So this is one of the reasons why the cultures are so different from one island to another island, because of isolation.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is, in English you say, they were not seafarers, which means they did not, by the time the Spanish came, they did not build ships and they did not communicate with each other.
Yeah. In fact, all the written chronicles of that time, excepting just one, but all of them, they say the Canary indigenous people didn't know how to sail. They didn't have boats. So this helps us to understand why cultures are so different from one island to another. So this may be a reason why, for example, in Tenerife there are few inscriptions if we compare them to those of El Hierro. I mean, it could be a question of different cultural traditions.
I think in your work too, and in some of you talk about involution as opposed to evolution.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe I'm thinking in terms of the absence of stone masonry buildings. It seems like they did not leave a lot of buildings made out of stone. And
well, for example, when they were living in the north of Africa, they had metals. They have knives, for example, but in the Canary Islands, we don't have minerals to make metals. We just have obsidian and some other rocks. So when they when they colonized the islands, they have to develop again stone tools. So this is a clear example of involution. And at the same time, when they were living in the north of Africa, there they had horses, for example, they had cows, they had camels, but when they came to the Canary Islands, they just brought with them small animals, for example, dogs, sheep, and goats. So this is an argument that let us think about the small and tiny characteristics of their ships. So when they arrived to the Canary Islands, they started to develop a culture which was clearly Amazigh, but was very, very strongly conditioned by the environment itself.
I know that the languages that they spoke were extinct, but did anything survive today?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because as it also happens in North America, in the Canary Islands, there has been a tradition developed by the academy about terminal narratives. Here, researchers have developed research on how these things disappear, how culture became affected, but not many efforts have been done in the sense of what was alive after the conquest. What do we keep from the indigenous period? And for example, in the case of Tenerife, there is a part in the north of the island called Icot, which is an indigenous name.
It is,
and and there is research that has been developed there, and we know that people who live nowadays in the 21st century, from the genealogical point of view, they have connections with the Canary indigenous people of the 15th century. Also from the DNA point of view. So there is a straight link from the conquest to the present, from the human point of view. And in this book in question, the researchers have captured quite a lot of traditions, dancings, and songs that come from the indigenous period. So not everything was lost. And especially, of course, culture was one of the most damaged aspects of their life. But, for example, in islands like Tenerife, 28% of the current Canarians have DNA, indigenous DNA. In the case, for example, of the island of La Gomera, 55%, which is quite a lot. And for example, in another island like Gran Canaria, 28% of the current DNA has indigenous roots. So people survive, indigenous people survive, and most of their traditions and culture was kept alive in the rural places, especially linked to...
You just mentioned La Gomera, and I think what I read is you said it's a high level of indigenous DNA, but it's mostly female line mitochondrial DNA, which some people suggest that the males were killed and then the females were kept. In a way.
That's it. In fact, it was the women who contributed to keep alive the indigenous line, as you said. Yes.
I want to ask you about something which I'm very skeptical of, but I want to ask an expert, okay? Why is it that there's still this talk about pyramids in the Canary Islands, and they're even associated with people such as Thor Heyerdahl? I'm a bit skeptical because I think maybe it's like more recent terracing work for agriculture, but why is people still talk about the mystery of the pyramids in the Canary Islands?
In fact, it is one of the more controversial aspects for the people who are not specialists on archaeology. And here in the Canary Islands, as you said before, we have mummies, but we can't call them mummies because they don't have connections with Egypt. And the way in which they were preserved has nothing to do with how the Egyptians prepare their mummies. We call them, the dead bodies receive the name saxos in the indigenous language, and our mummies would be called mirlados, not mummies. But as they have been called mummies since the 17th century, people started to establish relationships between Egypt and the Canary Islands. I mean, as we are very, very close to Africa,
Yeah.
people thought, well, I'm sure people think that they come from Egypt because we are by Africa. And at the same time, as there were some pyramidal constructions in the Canary Islands, they thought that this was linked at the same time. Mummies and pyramids in the Canary Islands should be related to the Egyptian culture. But nowadays, as I told you before, there are no connections between our mummies and the Egyptian ones, and the same happens with the pyramids. The ones we have in the Canary Islands were built in historical times and due to agricultural purposes, but nothing to do with the Canary indigenous people.
It's really inconceivable, say, to see in New Zealand, for example, human remains in museums, indigenous human remains in museums. So I'm just asking, has anybody thought about maybe giving these mummies a dignified reburial?
Yeah, I thank you for this question because the official speech in the Canary Islands has said the Canary indigenous people don't exist, the culture don't exist. But as I have told you before, we know nowadays that in several parts of the islands there are straight links from the 15th century until the present. There is a continuity from the human point of view. The thing is that most of the people of the Canary Islands don't have the feeling of belonging to the indigenous people. It's been wiped out by the colonial discourse. So a couple of months ago, our heritage, our law for the heritage was going to be approved, a new one, and I presented a technical inform because I consider that mummies should not be exhibited in museums, as you've already said. And also, as it has happened not only with the Maoris, but also in Argentina or in Northern America, human remains have been restituted to their people. So now, the next week, our new law for the heritage, for the Canarian heritage, will be approved, and finally we will have these aspects included. So if people ask for their mummies out of the museums, the government will have to take them away and give them back to the Canarian people. So now we have the chance to claim that. And this is totally new because that wasn't taken into consideration in the previous Canarian law, just in the new one. So maybe a new era, a new phase, a new conscience will arise in the Canary Islands regarding the ancient indigenous people.
Okay. Do you have any final message to our listeners?
Well, maybe one of the things I'm really concerned is that we have to do all the efforts in order to keep the ancient cultures and traditions alive, and especially the local cultures, because globalization is killing totally local identity, and we have to fight against that. We have to make all we can in order to keep our identity alive. We are citizens of the world, but we have to keep alive our traditions.